Hello, Matt. Nice to have you on the podcast. Thanks for coming.
Hey, happy to be here. Excited to see what we're going to talk about.
Yeah, so I reached out to you because I saw your tweet. I've been following you on Twitter for quite some time, and I saw your tweet about you forking Flutter. So, which is very interesting idea, I would say, very aspiring idea, and that's what we are going to discuss here. But maybe before we get into it, could you please share with the listeners some of your background, where you come from, and how did you get to the point when you are comfortable stating that you're going to fork Flutter?
Sure. I'll give you a quick rundown of my professional history, and then we can get into the Flutter side of things. I paid my way through college as a Flash developer. So in my undergrad years, I built Flash websites for fraternities and sororities around the country. And then in my master's program, I was hired by the department to work on some little video games because I was doing a master's in digital art and science. So that kind of fell in the scope of what the department was doing. But then after college, I became a professional Android developer. The first 7 years of my career were spent working with Android, and the final 3 years of that were spent at Nest. So for a while, everybody knew what Nest was, but in recent years, they've kind of faded into obscurity. So as a reminder, Nest was a company that became famous for creating a learning thermostat. It was a beautifully physically designed thermostat, but it would pay attention to when you're home, when you're away, time of day, weather, all these things. And it would set the temperature accordingly to save energy and to save money on your bill. Nest would go on to create a smoke detector that talks to you, so you know where a smoke emergency is or a carbon monoxide emergency, or if anyone's ever had low battery in their smoke detector and you get on a ladder to try to hear, okay, which one of these chirping smoke detectors is actually the one that's the problem? Well, the Nest smoke detector would just tell you where the low battery is. Then Nest purchased a company called Dropcam, which led to the Nest Cam lineup: indoor cameras, outdoor cameras, and a doorbell. And then finally, Nest created a home security system. Unfortunately, Google would go on to kind of strip Nest for parts. Nest is now little more than just a logo and a name, and it has been dispersed amongst various teams at Google. So there are some like Google Home products, which now are actually called Nest Home, like Nest Home Hub and stuff like that. I would say in large part, there's very little relationship between that device and that name versus the team that I was a part of and the company that I was a part of. In any event, that was the end of my Android career. But at the end of my time at Nest, we were prototyping a new internal project. It ended up not going anywhere. But at that time, we had to do some due diligence as to what are we going to use to build it. At that time, we all came from what people would call native or traditional Android and iOS. But listen, we're starting a new project, so we need to make sure that's the right approach for the future. I personally, at that time, this was the end of 2017, I investigated Flutter, React Native, and Angular Native. And for me at that time, I came away with the absolute clear choice was Flutter. It was Flutter above React Native and Angular Native, and it was
Which
also
was
Flutter.
early days of Flutter, really early days.
Yeah, this was pre 1.0. This was at a point where this was largely because I was inside of Google, but this was a point where kind of managers on the Flutter team were having direct conversations with Flutter users, asking about use cases and working through the challenges. So yes, very early. But again, just from the developer experience, in less than one workday, I had never written a single line of Dart code, never seen Dart code. I had never written a single line of Flutter code. In one workday, I was able to recreate the Nest login screen with animations and networking. So a true reproduction of the Nest login screen in one day, having never touched Flutter before. That was not the case with React Native. That was not the case with Angular Native. And even if I had sat down to recreate that screen in Android, it may have taken me more than a day to do it. So it was a clear choice at that point. And that prototype then used Flutter. We used Flutter for a few months until we realized that prototype wasn't really going anywhere, not related to Flutter, just related to the product side. And at that point, I saw the direction Nest was going. I said, okay, I think I'm done here. And I transferred to the Flutter team. I spent 2 years working on the Flutter team, and most of that time was spent rewriting, ironically, the Android embedding for Flutter. I enabled what is called add to app. So when I arrived at the Flutter team, and this is kind of inside baseball for Android developers, but Flutter assumed that your app only had one activity in the whole app, and it was the Flutter activity. That was baked into the Android embedding code. What the team realized fairly early on was there are very large apps out there with 1,000 screens. They're not going to rewrite the app just so they can use Flutter. Instead, you need to be able to tactically add Flutter to a little area of a large existing app. But the current state of the Android embedding, and this was also true of iOS at the time, couldn't handle it. There were baked in assumptions that made that impossible. So I was tasked with making that possible on the Android side. And that took up most of the 2 years I was on the team. Then I left in 2020. And since then, I've done contract development, consulting, open source development, some corporate training, free education. And that's what I've been doing up till this moment, where recently, as you pointed out, I announced in partnership with another developer that we're going to fork Flutter for various reasons.
Yeah, well, that's very interesting. I'll just ask you to go deeper a little bit about your time at Google and working on Flutter. It sounded to me, and please correct me if I got it wrong, that the assumption was that Flutter will be for just new applications, and your work enabled embedding Flutter into the existing projects. Would that be correct?
I think that's largely correct. There's still, it's not just new apps though. Like if you had an app and you were willing to rewrite it, you would still have the app. Like it wouldn't be a new venture or a new company. It's the same app, just you would have rewritten it using a different technology.
Scratch.
Right, from scratch. Now, that's actually, on the one hand, it sounds really crazy. On the other hand, those of us who have been in this industry long enough, we know that every few years, developers tend to make such a mess of their code that they get to a point where they tell management, listen, we just have to rewrite the whole thing. Now, that is the height of irresponsibility. Don't get me wrong. It is insane that developers get away with that. But also we know the reality. Developers make an absolute mess of their code base, and then they come to management and they say, we just got to rewrite it because that's just the way software works. So despite the fact that that's a lie, in a world where apps are rewritten every few years, it's not unreasonable to think maybe the next time that company rewrites their app, they'll use Flutter instead of whatever they used before. However, I think the Flutter organization just that cycle was too long. They needed to see more adoption more quickly to warrant their continued existence. And that's what led to the conclusion that we really do need to facilitate this concept of add to app.
So just as an anecdote, the project I'm currently involved in embeds Flutter. Like it's a big legacy application, and part of it is shared using Flutter between the Android and the iOS teams. And so I guess that will be your part at Google enabling this specific use case. But that's just an anecdote. And you've been working as a freelance developer trainer, basically content creator, for the past couple of years. And now you come out and you say, I'm going to fork Flutter. And so I think it's important to just explain people what forking means, because many developers, especially newer developers, they think that forking is the button that you have on GitHub. You click on it, you fork the project, and then you're done. And then basically everyone can fork Flutter. So not a very interesting topic to discuss. But what you really want to do is to fork the project. So please explain what you see as like the project that you start right now. What's involved in forking Flutter?
Sure. We can talk about the problem and the solution there. I will say that in forking actually is what you described. I mean, technically there are many different reasons you can fork something, and really the meaning of the word is just we have created a copy of the project with all of the history up to that point. There are various reasons that people do that, including even just, for example, enterprise companies often fork every project they depend upon just in case the originating project is closed down or disappears. It's a risk management move. So there are many different reasons you can fork it. But some people give a lot of extra meaning to that word, and they assumed that what we were doing was trying to diverge from Flutter or somehow replace Flutter. And that couldn't be further from the truth. So here's the problem that I've laid this out in a few different places, but I'll describe it here as well. Let's just imagine that you're a company using Flutter and your next feature is blocked by Flutter. That could happen in one of two common ways. One way is that Flutter has a bug that is unworkable. You can't get around it. Problem two, or option two, is there's some feature that you totally expected Flutter to have. It should be in Flutter, but it's not there yet. And you can't implement it yourself. It has to go into Flutter. At that point, you're blocked. You can't release that feature. What do you do? And what I've said to this is that you have exactly 4 options here. Option 1 is you wait for Flutter to do the work. Now, you could do the work as well and put up a pull request and hope the Flutter team merges it, but you're still stuck waiting for the Flutter team to accept it and merge it for you to be able to use it.
Yeah, and it's a high bar to open a pull request into a project as complex as Flutter.
Yes, there's a lot you need to know, and also there's a lot you need to comply with, and also the team can only review your work when they have time to review it, and spoiler alert, they don't have a lot of free time. So some people are very successful at getting changes into Flutter, and that's great. Other people are very unsuccessful at getting changes into Flutter, and it's not a surprise that they get frustrated when they fail to get their change in. So that's option 1. You can sit there and wait. Managers really do not like that option. Believe it or not, they don't want to sit around waiting for some other team they don't control. Option number 2 is that if there is some other fork of Flutter that has the change you need, you could go use that fork. Presently, I'm not aware of any popular community fork. There are forks for very special purposes. So for example, Shorebird has a fork of Flutter, but their fork of Flutter is specifically to implement code push, which is the service that they sell people. Very valuable service, very important service, but that's not a generic community fork that can be used to alleviate these problems. Option 3 is that you can fork Flutter, fix the issue locally in your fork, and then ship your app on top of your fork of Flutter. This requires that you have all the knowledge necessary, once again, to fix the problem, and you also know how to build the engine, you know how to distribute the engine to your team, and you can build the engine in CI and these things.
Yeah, this requires even more knowledge than just contributing to Flutter. That's like ultimate option for if you if you can convince your management to do that, and 2, if you actually has the technical chops and you really understand Flutter top down.
Right. And then option number 4, this is the final option. This is the worst option. Option number 4 is to stop using Flutter. So if you're blocked and Flutter can't merge your change anytime soon, and there's no existing fork with the solution, and you don't know how to fork Flutter yourself, your only remaining option is to stop using Flutter. And my point to the Flutter community is that is an awful option for all of us because it eliminates jobs in the present day, it eliminates jobs in the future, and it sends a signal to other companies that maybe you shouldn't be using Flutter either. It's a very dangerous pattern if it were to become common.
Sorry, I will interrupt you here. If you decide that you need to go down this road, do you mean stop using Flutter, like rewrite into native, or implement some bridge and rewrite features and write specific features in native?
Probably both of those are on the table. That would depend on the team, but it wouldn't surprise me, especially if you have a startup or an agency or a smaller effort. It wouldn't surprise me if they just ditch Flutter entirely in that case. I would hope not. I would hope they wouldn't do that, but it wouldn't surprise me. I mean, stranger things have been done. I'm sure you remember a few years ago when there was kind of a spate of blog posts of companies announcing that they're getting rid of React Native from their code base. It is not unheard of for companies. They try something for a little while for various reasons. It doesn't work the way they were hoping and they eject it. I really want to minimize the amount that happens to Flutter because that's the kind of thing that can really derail overall Flutter adoption and job opportunities and things like that. And so given those 4 options that I described to you, if option 1 is out of our control, I can't force the Flutter team to ever do anything and you can't either. Option 4 is the worst one. We want to avoid it. The only 2 options that remain, option 2, there's some kind of community fork that is willing to bring changes in more quickly. And option 3, help people reduce the friction as much as humanly possible to help people create their own fork when they need to. Option number 2 is our fork called Flock. Option number 3 is a collection of tools that we're building to help people fork Flutter called Nest. So we are working on both option 2 and option 3. And now hopefully you understand a bit more about the problem and how we arrived at that solution.
Yeah, that's very interesting. And I didn't know that you also build a set of tools to basically make it easier for other companies to fork Flutter. And now we'll probably go deeper into the Flutter architecture and understanding what exactly the parse and what involves this, initially what it involves. But just at a very high level, could you explain, like in 5 minutes, the general architecture of Flutter and what are the big chunks? Like, I know that there is a part of the framework that's written in Dart. There's part of the framework that's written in C or C++, some lower level stuff, where it comes to interact with the Android platform, where it comes to interact with iOS, and which parts of these layers are you going to fork in your Flock initiative?
Sure. Flutter at the highest level can be thought of as 2 pieces, the framework and the engine. The Flutter framework is, I believe, entirely, or at least almost entirely, written in Dart. The same code that you write in your Flutter apps, that's the kind of code you're going to find all over the framework. The framework has widgets like row and column and stack and padding and container. It also has widgets like list tile and Cupertino tab stuff. It has a lot of these high level UI pieces as well. And the other half is the engine. The engine, it has a tiny bit of Dart code in it, but it's mostly a combination of C++ and per platform code. The C++ code is often referred to as the embedder or the portable part of the engine, the part that's compiled. The same C++ code is compiled to all the different platforms. However, again, those who are already app developers, Android developers, iOS developers, you know that there are pieces of Android and iOS that you have to use to be able to deploy an app. So for example, on Android, you're going to have an Android manifest. You're going to have at least one activity. If you need to do things in the background that has to be done through a service, these are actually operating system constraints in Android. These aren't just merely application decisions. So if Flutter is going to run in an Android app, it has to have those pieces as well. That means that in the engine, there's some amount of Java code for things like a Flutter activity, Flutter fragment, Flutter view. Back when I was doing add to app, I also made it possible to run Dart code in the background. So I believe there's still something like a Flutter service that you can run as well if you want to write that code yourself. So that code is also in the engine. And it's not just Android. There's the iOS code where you're going to have your application delegate and your view controller and your Xcode workspace. You'll find similar things for Windows and Mac and Linux. The web part of the engine is where things get a bit more unusual. And I've never dug into that part of the engine. My partner on Flock, his name is Jesse. He's actually all about the web side of things. So he could probably talk to you for hours about how that part of the engine works. But there's also some part of it that is web focused. My understanding is that the web part of the engine actually has a lot more Dart code than the non-web part. But again, I don't have a lot of specifics on that, so I can't talk much about the web. So the framework, when you actually use Flutter, when you develop with Flutter, you consume the framework as source code. What this means is that if you are using a widget from the framework in your IDE, let's just say you're in Android Studio, you can jump to the actual Flutter framework definition of that widget in your IDE. There's no binary that hides the code. It's not like late linking. You can actually go read the Flutter framework code in your IDE. And not only can you read it, you can change it right there in your IDE. And then if you rebuild your app, you will get the changes that you just made to the framework locally.
So you basically compile the entire framework every time you compile your app?
Yeah. Now I'm guessing there's some level of caching there so that you
Yeah,
don't do
sure.
that unnecessarily. But yes, essentially you're compiling the framework with your app when you compile your app. And so I think that's a really great aspect of Flutter. I think it's really helpful. You can read it, you can alter it. That's not true for the engine, because the engine, given that it's coming from C++ code, it actually is compiled to a binary for your particular architecture. And therefore, if you ever want to change the engine, you actually have to recompile it. And that's a totally different tooling path than anything you do with the framework. So there's a wiki that tells you do this, then this, then this, then this. You just blindly kind of follow those steps in the wiki, and you can compile your own version of the engine. But then you also need to tell the Flutter framework where to find your custom build of the engine. Once you do that, then you can deploy your app using your custom engine with whatever changes you made. But it's quite a bit more time and effort than just altering the framework.
And as part of Flock, which layers here are you going to fork and contribute to?
So we've forked the whole thing. We expect that over time we will make some number of changes to the framework and the engine. On the one hand, it would be nice to say we don't want to change the engine. On the other hand, the reality is that I think a lot of the greatest value to Flock is actually in the engine. The engine is the bottleneck for most things in Flutter. Once you're in the framework, for the most part, you can do whatever you want. But the engine is what decides which pieces of the platform get exposed to your application. One big area where this has been a consistent friction for me, I created a project called Super Editor, which is a document editing toolkit for Flutter apps. So you can build completely custom document or text editors using Flutter. Obviously, that work is fundamentally tied to the text input or content input system of the operating system. That's known as the IME, the Input Method Editor. That's part of every operating system that interacts with the keyboard. So for example, on your Android phone or your iOS phone, your iPhone, when you're typing on that software keyboard, it doesn't go directly to the application. It goes to the operating system's IME. And then the IME forwards the information to your app. Well, that means that IME communication has to be exposed by Flutter to your app because it's part of the platform. Flutter has exposed only a relatively small portion of the IME to the application. And so, and there are also some bugs related to that current implementation. So we have kind of been restricted for years trying to build this document editing toolkit because we can't get access to the operating system information because Flutter doesn't give it to us. And that decision is made in the engine. We can't expose more of it unless we alter the engine. And that story repeats for a number of different behaviors. It's not at all just related to text input, but that's why the engine actually might be an area where we need to make a number of changes.
Yeah, very funny that you chose the IME example to demonstrate the problem, because in Android, in native Android, the soft keyboard is known to be a real pain in the neck. And it's kind of ironic that the pain in the neck keeps propagating into other frameworks like Flutter that is built on top of Android. Great. So you are going to fork the full thing and you're going to contribute, hopefully, and Google will accept your contribution. Basically, you're going to develop your own project in a hope that maybe Google will then decide to take some of the pieces that you contributed and integrate them into the main Flutter repository. And there are two of you and Jesse. Doesn't sound like enough hands on to pull off something like that. So what's your idea of this project? Where do you get contributors? How do you, will you compensate them, or is it fully like open source, free time, enthusiastic idea? Could you please explain how you see this project evolving going forward?
Yeah. So the two of us are just the two people kicking this off. And we're also the two of us, we're going to try to build out all of the contribution infrastructure first, but then it's all about recruiting people from the community to make this happen. Our hope is we've identified a real problem here that many companies face. And so our hope is that there is enough interest in the community to take part in this. We've had anywhere between 30 to 50 people reach out so far in various ways. People saying, I want to contribute, or I want to be a reviewer, or I want to be a lead. Of course, for anyone who's ever recruited a community effort before, you learn that, maybe 1 out of 10 people are actually qualified to do it. So we'll see how many of those people actually fit. But to your question, yes, we are going to recruit people from the community to rally around this and make it happen. There is going to be a charity model. There won't be any compensation, not for me, not for Jesse, not for anybody else. I'm open to that changing in the future. But the reason that I'm saying up front that it's charity is because there's no way, that's an entirely different problem to solve. And it's unclear if we're going to be able to solve it. And I say that as somebody who runs a small open source team that is paid by clients. So for example, over on SuperEditor, we have received funding from Superlist, ClickUp, Clearful, Reflection, Bringing Fire, Turtle. A number of companies have funded that work. And I continue to recruit companies to fund any and all of our open source packages. But there aren't a lot of companies that are willing to do that. And it's a pretty big struggle to get them involved. I think once they do start funding open source, they're very happy with it, but it's a tough sell.
Yeah.
So if we get to the point where we can compensate people, I'm 100% open to doing it. I'm just not going to start with that promise because it's unclear if we can deliver that.
But from the company's standpoint, right, they have the choice either to use the official Flutter or use Flock. And as a decision maker in a company, they would like to see some, let's say, social proof of your product. And it's kind of a chicken and an egg problem, right? You want companies to use your product, but other companies want to see other companies use your product. And on the other hand, the contributors want to work on something that's being used in the real world. So you can start, but let's say in some period of time, in a year, let's say, if no one uses Flock, then it will probably be very difficult to convince people to keep contributing going forward. Do you have an idea of how you kind of go to market strategy for this initiative, how you recruit the first clients who will, not clients, first users who will give it a try, take on this risk?
Jesse and I think that our Nest tools are going to be a big part of that answer. Let's say that you are afraid to use our fork for whatever reason. And maybe it's just a latent fear, like there's no technical reason, you're just uncomfortable with it. Well, if you are in that situation that we described earlier, your other option is to fork Flutter yourself. Mm-hmm. And what you can do is you can use our tools that we give you to create your fork. Then you don't have to worry about what's included in our fork. You can make every little decision about that yourself, and we've made it easy on you. But once you've done that for a little while, once you've maintained your own fork, everything's working, the question's going to come up, which is, why are we spending our money maintaining our own fork when there's this other fork that's out there? And oh, by the way, we're using the same tools they're using and everything worked for us just fine. So what's wrong with their fork? And I think that will tend to eventually lead those companies to stop spending extra money maintaining their fork when they can just use ours. But also in addition to that, I work with various clients. Clients come and go. So over the years, I just accumulate more and more client relationships. If these problems come up with them, I will be the one in the room letting those clients know, hey, there's this fork over here. Maybe at least for a couple releases, you should use this fork to unblock yourself. And if I'm able to make that case, I'll ask those companies to be public about their use of it. And maybe we'll start accumulating the logos on the website, that kind of thing, saying we've unblocked the following companies, and that will begin the social proof. But all of this is a hypothesis. It's aspirational. So we'll see what actually happens. But if you're right, I mean, if this goes on for a year and virtually no companies make use of it, including the Nest tools, then yeah, there's at that point, either we've demonstrated the problem isn't big enough to warrant the work, or we've demonstrated that for some reason the fear of using a fork is so incredibly high that we're not going to be able to break through. So we'll just have to wait and see how successful or not successful we are at the end of the day.
And what do you expect the delta between your fork and real Flutter to be? Like, let's say if a company decides to use your fork and they want to estimate the risk, they want to know what will it take to migrate back to the original Flutter if something goes wrong, if it doesn't work out. How do you see this back migration, backwards compatibility with Flutter, and what amount of effort do you estimate there to be for the company?
Our expectation for Flock is that it is as close to Flutter as possible at any given time. So we're assembling our guidance right now for contributions, but in that guidance, we have stated before anybody files a ticket with us, they must first file a ticket with Flutter, and they must give the Flutter team an opportunity to solve their problem before asking us to solve their problem. We are only the place that we're kind of the implementer of last resort. You come to us when the Flutter team can't or won't do what you want. But let's say you come to us, we implement something that the Flutter team hasn't had time to do, and we get it to you and you ship with Flock. We would like the Flutter team to then come to Flock, grab the patch, and go apply it to Flutter. We've done the work, right? We've implemented it. We've written the tests. People are now shipping it in production, so it is somewhat proven. We've eliminated essentially all the work we possibly can from the Flutter team. We'd like to see them take 5 minutes, come grab the patch, and add it to Flutter. And when they do that, we'll first deprecate it in Flock, and then in short order, we'll delete it. And it will be as if it was never there. And in that regard, over time, our goal again is to stay as close to Flutter as humanly possible. And in fact, to further make that possible, Jesse and I got together last weekend here in the Bay Area, and we started hacking on our approach to accepting contributions. Instead of taking the traditional Git history approach where you just commit your changes and it gets added to this global history of the project, we started with the notion that we need companies to know what exactly Flock includes and what it doesn't include. What work was done to Flock versus Flutter itself. We pretty quickly came to the realization that interleaving our changes in Flutter's Git history is going to make that impossible. Think about a change that we made 6 months ago. How would you ever find that in the Flutter history? So instead, a member of the community came to us and suggested that we look at Electron and how they approach this. Electron's approach, at least in terms of they roll other projects into Electron, like Chromium, for example, and sometimes they have to modify those projects. So what Electron did is every change they make is saved to a file. So it's your Git commit is a file in the repository. And then those files are replayed every time you update the upstream project. That's what we went ahead and implemented last weekend. We're still kind of working through the details of it. But what that means is when you propose a change to Flutter, we can review it as if it's a normal Git commit. But what you actually commit is a file with a list of all the changes. And we've included a script that will generate that file for you so you don't have to understand how that happens. But our repository will then collect a directory filled with these patches. So if you want to know, hey, what is everything that Flock ever did on top of Flutter? There's literally a directory with files that will show you every change ever made. And the title of those files will reflect what's in them. The files will contain the author, the date, the commit log, and every day that we update Flutter, because we bring in all the changes from Flutter every day. Every day that we bring in the changes from Flutter, we replay our changes on top. So we don't interleave them in the history. You don't have to go down 1,000 commits to figure out where our changes are applied. We keep putting them on top, which will lead to some conflicts over time, and that's okay. But because these are patch files, we can actually, when we run into conflicts, we can create a temporary branch that's solely dedicated to resolving conflicts. And we can actually pass that branch around to different contributors so that each person who actually knows what each patch does, they can resolve that one patch, go to the next conflict, and hand it off to whatever developer knows how to deal with that patch. So any of you out there you've ever done a rebase with conflicts, you know how much of a pain that can be when you have to go through 100 commits on your own to resolve all the conflicts. By using the file system, each developer only has to resolve the conflict that they know how to resolve and then hand it off to somebody else. So that's a taste of the infrastructure that we are building specifically so that, one, we're always up to date with Flutter, and two, any company that wants to use Flock knows exactly what we've done to Flutter and what we haven't done.
Interesting approach. I haven't heard about it before. So it's basically some infrastructure on top of Git. And then instead of storing the information just in Git commits, you in addition have files, right? And then when the times come to see what's the state of the repository, you basically convert those files into commits, which are rebased on top of whatever Flutter, their current master branch of Flutter, or whatever they call it, right?
Yeah, and of course, like if you do a git diff at any given time, there's already a format for what a patch looks like, right? I mean, your commits in Git history are patches. They are essentially our patch files. You just don't see them because they're in the Git database. They're in that hidden Git folder. We're just elevating those files into the actual repository history. So instead of, your point is correct that we are using Git commits as files, and we are then applying them to Git whenever we want to. So I think your description is a reasonable approximation.
So basically, a company that wants to evaluate the delta between Flock and Flutter can look at this directory with files and see what's going on there. But at some point, I guess, if this project is successful, there will be so many files that just the action of looking through these files and understanding will not be that feasible. But at that point, you will probably have different problems.
So it depends how we define success. If you define success as merely us delivering a lot of value, then your description is correct. My bar for success is higher than that, which is if we are truly successful, Flutter is applying as many of our changes as possible back to itself. And if that's happening, then we retain a small number of patches. Now, part of the reason that we're doing this is because it has been hard at times to get the Flutter team to take some things seriously. So I don't have any delusions of grandeur about the Flutter team coming to us and taking our changes. But if we want to say, what does the most successful version of Flock look like? It's a version of Flock that has like 10 patches at any given time, not 1,000.
That's a very important distinction. Thanks for clarifying, because you said it multiple times and only now I finally see the whole picture and clicks for me. So basically, your idea of a successful Flock is basically very thin wrapper around Flutter, and as many of Flock's contributions being merged back into the main Flutter project, so you don't need to actually maintain them. And this repository with files, it will not grow unlimited. It will contain a small set of just latest patches or patches that Flutter team for some reason don't want to merge into their own code base.
That's right. And so that's the pinnacle of success. But if we want to say like, what's the halfway level to success? That's the one that you described, which is, unfortunately, the Flutter team is not upstreaming many of our changes, but we are delivering a lot of value, which means we're delivering a lot of patches. Now, here's one really interesting thing that we might try to do in the future because we're using a file-based patch system. Imagine that instead of merely pointing at the one singular distribution of Flock, imagine that you came to our website and you had a list of features that you could add or not add to Flock. Because every one of those patches has a description, right? So imagine our website reads all of those descriptions and lets you decide, I want this one, I want this one, I don't want this one, I want this one.
So kind of like you build tools like FF and PEG, right? Where you decide which portions you want to build with. So something like that. Pick and choose whatever you want from your contributions.
Yeah, similar to that. And in that regard, again, I hope that I hope that most companies learn that they don't need to be so concerned. Like this shouldn't be a high risk thing. But if that's what we're dealing with, then this is another way for us to handle that, which is if we have some of what you need, but we also have other stuff that you're worried is a risk, maybe that means we need to make it possible for you to pick just the patches you need. Of course, that actually doesn't even require extra tooling. I mean, I think it'd be cool to create that website experience. I think people would find that to be pretty neat and convenient. But the alternative, of course, is that you can just fork Flock, delete all the patches you don't want, and then use that. So there are a number of escape hatches here if you want them. But our goal will be to make Flock as readily convenient as possible so that you don't have to use any of the escape hatches.
Yeah, and this will work seamlessly in the layer that's written in Dart, right? But for the engine part that's written in native code or C++, that will be a little bit more involved, because then if you want to pick and choose, then you really need to recompile it from scratch yourself.
Well, any change to the engine will require a custom engine build. However, I don't think that actually impacts what I just described. So our changes to the engine will also be represented as patch files. And as long as changes are in patch files, you have the option to delete a patch file or to not use a patch file. But your point is true in terms of infrastructure. One of the things we have to solve no matter what is, how do we get you the compiled version of the Flock engine? This is something that Jesse and his team are investigating and working on. But at the end of the day, what it means is that at some regular interval, probably in GitHub CI, we need to run the compilation process of the engine for all supported architectures. And then from CI, we need to upload that into cloud storage. And then the Flutter tool, when you say things like Flutter pub get, Flutter run, Flutter build, in that tool, we need to make some alterations so that instead of getting the regular Flutter engine, you get the engine that we built based on Flock. But again, that's something we have to solve no matter what. But once we do that, you can still opt into whatever patches you want.
Do you mean that you will build these engines for companies that want to apply specific patches to the engine, or that they will still need to build it on their machine? Because building something like that sounds like non-trivial amount of work. As you described, Flutter, since it's basically shipped as the source code and you kind of build it alongside your own project, then your patches to the framework, Dart framework, are very easy to get, right? You just get the source code and then you build your application. But if you want to get a custom build engine, it's probably a lot more involved than that.
So there are two ways this can go. One is that you choose to fork Flock so that you can delete patches. In that case, building the engine is your job, your responsibility. However, our goal is to provide whatever tools we can to make that as painless as possible. So for example, if we are building and uploading through GitHub Actions, those actions are available to you as well. You can copy those actions, and then you just need to insert it'd probably be a handful of variables like where's your cloud storage, that kind of thing. But once you input those variables, you should be able to run the same script that we run and get your engine wherever you want it. So that's if you fork Nest or fork Flock for that purpose. As for the idea that we might let you pick different patches, if we do that, if we put up a website that lets you customize your build, we will also need to solve the problem of how do we build the engine for you. In that case, I don't think we want to make you build it. I think we need to provide the infrastructure to build it and get it to you. That's a feature that would be quite far in the future. We have a lot to do before we get there. But if we get there, I think, yes, we need to build it for you. I think it's asking too much of you to figure out how to build that yourself.
Now, maybe a little bit uncomfortable question, but for any project to survive, especially projects that are not just like small library that a single developer can maintain, but something like yours, you need a business model. And you say that you would hope that if this project is successful, then companies who use Flock will be contributing back. But first of all, I don't know, like, can you really maintain a full-scale project of this size with these contributions, sponsorships from the companies? So, and then the question becomes like, do you have a longer term business plan for this project? Basically, do you intend to provide some premium services? Let's say you are successful, you put in several years of work into this project, it is useful, and even let's say Google does take your patches and apply some of them to the core Flutter framework. How do you see the business model of this project evolving over the course of multiple years if it is indeed so successful?
So I don't think I agree with the premise. We can dig into your follow-ups, but the premise is this can't succeed at a high level long-term without a business model. I do think there are plenty of counterexamples in the world of projects that take little to no funding, but have done amazing things and have done it for a long time. Whether this will be one of those remains to be seen, but I don't want to be fatalistic about that. Saying that this can't succeed in the long run without funding is not necessarily true. However, if the question is, how might funding work? I also, along those lines, I don't want to exaggerate the scope of this project. 99.5% of Flock will always be Flutter. The biggest, deepest problems will be handled by the Flutter team. We're not trying to take those roles. We don't have the capacity to take those roles. And as we just discussed a moment ago, if this project actually is the highest level of success that it can be, our quote maintenance burden is a few dozen patches. That really shouldn't take a lot of people, and it shouldn't take a lot of effort. So therefore, there shouldn't be a large need for funding. But I am, given that I run the Flutter Bounty Hunters, I am of the opinion that valuable developers doing valuable things should be compensated for their effort. If this is a successful project with a decent number of companies that use it, I will do everything I can to incentivize funding, and I will then try to funnel that funding to the people who are showing up and writing the patches and reviewing them and leading the effort. I just can't promise any of that at this point because there are so many variables between now and there. So I can say that I'm open to it. In fact, I don't know if this conversation will even go anywhere or happen, but someone did reach out saying, hey, we might be interested in providing some open source funding. Again, that most of those, I've had inquiries like that in the past. Most of them go absolutely nowhere, but occasionally they do go somewhere. And if an organization wants to start putting money into this and still let us drive the direction of it, of course we'll do that, because the people who come and write the code and review the code deserve to be compensated for that valuable work. It's just a question of whether or not we can pull it off. But it is also important to understand that because we're solving real problems, there are a lot of people with incentives to show up. The reason that Jesse is leading this effort with me is because he's running a startup that has been immensely impacted by problems in the Flutter web engine for years. And he has tried many avenues to get those things fixed with the team. He's reported numerous bugs. He's put up PRs with fixes. Occasionally the team will accept one of those fixes, but there are some that just linger. And his startup is dependent on an area that's buggy. Like, what is he supposed to do? So like right now, he has members of his startup team who are spending some amount of time helping with this, because if we're successful, that's going to unblock him and his company. I think we will find that there are a number of companies in a similar situation. And that doesn't just take the form of direct funding. Maybe those companies don't provide direct funding, but what those companies might do is use the salary they're already paying some of their developers and have those developers spend some of their time contributing to Flock, because that company will gain way more in value from Flock than paying that salary than if they just said, no way, we're not going to get involved. We're not going to use Flock and we're not going to pay anyone to contribute. So I do think that's likely a pattern that we'll see is companies serving their best interest by putting some of their resources into Flock.
Yeah, that's very, very interesting. And indeed, I don't presume that you need the business model, but I would say that I'm biased towards business model is beneficial if you want a successful project, and it's just more difficult practically to pull it off without one. But what you described now can actually work, I think. By the way, like in terms of companies doing stuff like modifying Flutter framework or rolling out custom solutions, is this something that's currently a thing in the Flutter ecosystem? Because I can't imagine any company rolling out their own version of AOSP, except for, of course, like if you're Amazon and you want to ship your own tablet and sell it. But I mean, like if you're building startup, you wouldn't go and modify AOSP to, well, you cannot do anything with it unless you have your custom device even. It's just not an option.
Well, so one of my clients that I was working with a little over a year and a half ago, they are manufacturing their own tablet and they're running Flutter for all their UI. But just to your point about AOSP, they did alter AOSP. If you're shipping if you need control over hardware, you might alter AOSP. Similarly, if you need control over your user interface, you might alter Flutter. So it's not just a question of what's a big open source project. The question is also the scope. AOSP is an operating system and an entire application framework. Flutter is a UI toolkit. So the reasons that you would ever touch AOSP are very different from the reasons that you would ever touch Flutter. Also, the scope of AOSP is probably orders of magnitude larger than Flutter. But to the question of, does any company ever really fork Flutter? I've actually been surprised at the number of companies I run into that have their own private fork for the reasons I specified. They absolutely needed something for their product. They couldn't get it through Flutter itself, so they forked Flutter and they patched it. And now, then they're on the hook for all the things we've described. They're on the hook for updating their version of Flutter. But yes, there are clients out there that absolutely do that. I'm not saying they aren't doing what Flock is doing. They're not accumulating a growing number of changes, but whatever few things they need, yes, they apply it to their fork. Now, if Flutter ever fixes those bugs or implements those features, those companies are more than happy to delete their fork, but they have to maintain that fork as long as their product needs those things that aren't in Flutter. And that does happen. I have no idea what like the proportion is, but it wouldn't surprise me if the answer is something like 1 in 10. That wouldn't shock me.
Wow, this sounds amazingly high. Okay, first of all, you are right. I gave a wrong example. A better example would probably be like forking JetBrains Compose or even specific libraries within the ecosystem.
Probably React Native. That'd be my most reasonable comp is if you were to fork React Native for your project.
Yeah, well, I don't know, never worked with React Native, so hard to say. I try to find an analogy from my world, which is native Android development. And in general, I have never seen companies forking like full frameworks that Google provides in order to implement changes. Usually people just submit issues to Google's issue tracker, and most of them never go nowhere.
Yeah, so another comp within Google might be Angular Dart. Now, Angular Dart, I think, is dead and has been for some time. But my guess is there were people who probably forked Angular Dart to modify it. The reason that it's really tough to find an example in Android is because there's such an iron grip from the Android team on all things Android. And also, it's just operated in a way that kind of disincentivizes contribution in that manner. So like between Google's influence on Android and JetBrains' influence on Android, there really isn't much opportunity for anybody else in that equation. And like you mentioned, forking Jetpack Compose, but even though technically Jetpack Compose is in a Jetpack package, really it's just a tentacle of the larger Android beast. It's not really clear that there's a meaningful dividing line between Jetpack Compose and the rest of Android. So what does it even really mean to fork Jetpack Compose? Can you actually do that in a meaningful way? Whereas Flutter or React Native or Angular Dart, there's a pretty crystal clear line between that project and the surrounding context. And so forking those, it is obvious what you mean, and you can do it without getting involved in this nightmare of a much larger project.
Yeah, someone once said, there is no problem in computer science that can't be solved with some level of abstraction. And it sounds like Flutter and all these other projects that provide much better level of abstraction that you can plug your code into then. Let's say Jetpack Compose, which I agree is very tightly coupled to basically everything in Android at this point.
Yeah. And one of my, again, as someone who wrote Android code for a long time, one of my hypotheses as to why Android APIs are historically so awful is that the people, it would seem the people charged with designing those APIs are the same people charged with implementing the operating system, which is just, it's not a very smart move, because the way, if you look at the average developer who does systems development, like operating systems, their background and their level of intelligence and the way they talk is so different from someone who's putting buttons on a screen or paragraphs or drawers or videos. And yet the people doing the systems development are deciding how the ergonomics of the APIs used by the people who are like this far from the design team. And my guess is that played a significant role in the horrendous nature of a lot of Android APIs.
Yeah, I think your guess is absolutely correct. And historically, that was the case. Today, it's a little bit less obvious that there's this very tight coupling between those responsibilities. But at this point, I think just it looks like people who build this API just never or almost never build the real apps. So they just can't put them, very difficult for them to put themselves into the shoes of developers who will consume this API. So that would be my supplemental theory to yours.
Along those lines, I mean, that's a common problem, in fact. So that's one of the things that I've brought up about the Flutter team. In the early days of Flutter, the earliest team would actually sit down with someone who was using Flutter. They would sit behind them and watch them code. Wouldn't talk to them, wouldn't direct them, would just say, listen, you build the way you think you should build with Flutter, and we're going to take some notes. That's what informed the early APIs of Flutter. And I think it's no accident that the absolute best APIs in Flutter are the ones from 2016 and 2017. And they've kind of gotten progressively worse, in my opinion. And I think a real big part of the reason why is that the people who are defining the APIs either never build anything with Flutter themselves, or all they build is a little side project, which, okay, that'll exercise a little bit, but you really don't understand what it's like to be in a fast-paced company that has to ship real value every single day or every single week. And so I think that team is becoming more and more out of touch with the ergonomics that are required for people who actually have to ship with Flutter. What I would really love to see, this is never going to happen for all sorts of reasons, but what I would love to see is a reorganization of the Flutter framework team. I don't care so much about the engine team. That's a very different beast. But the framework, which is the part that you and I use every day, I think that team should be replaced almost entirely with members from the community. People who have actually shipped Flutter apps for a period of years, they should be the framework developers because they know what's required of the ergonomics and they have strong relationships with companies that are actively shipping products with Flutter. I think that would likely result in significant API improvements versus what we've gotten over the last few years, which I'm sorry to say has not been particularly high quality.
Yeah, unfortunately, this route, which will probably be most beneficial to the framework, will be most detrimental to the careers of people working and earning their salary from Google working on Flutter. So, I mean, there is a lot of politics there, of course. By the way, it's very interesting that you mentioned that the best APIs come from the past, and over time they gradually became worse. Because in Android, I think it's a general consensus that it will be reversed. So the initial framework was really bad, and Android developers with let's say a decade of experience, they would know you probably knew these components like sync adapter and content provider and async tasks. All these bits were very, very difficult to understand and use, very complicated components. And then at some point we got to the point of better components. And now, at least I wouldn't necessarily agree with that, but most developers I think would agree with that Android became better and evolves in the right direction of simplifying stuff. However, I've been talking to one very experienced developer lately, and he has experience in both Flutter and Android and native Android development. And he told me that he had very high expectations of JetBrains Compose, but from Flutter times. But what he found was really poor implementation of the same ideas. And as far as I know, JetBrains Compose started from Flutter. So basically, I think the initial code was basically just converted from Dart to Kotlin. And over time, it looks like this maybe lack of this feedback loop that you've just described, with people sitting behind engineers and looking at what they do and how they use the API, a lack of this feedback loop just caused the end result be so much worse than what Flutter achieved, which is quite amazing, right? I don't know if you've been always Flutter maximalist as you describe yourself, but I was Flutter skeptic for a very long time.
I was, when I first used it, I was highly skeptical. Because I lived through all of the same experiences that everyone else did in the mobile world from 2007 to, at that point, 2017, which was everybody keeps trying to create these universal application frameworks, and every one of them is awful. Every one of them, you get beyond just the superficial level and they fall apart. The performance goes to garbage, or you end up needing to go to all the specific platform details anyway, and it's just a waste of time. That was my assumption of what Flutter was going to be. I was just willing to try it and find out, and I was very pleasantly surprised that this was the first time one of these attempts actually delivered on the promise. But as to your point about Android getting simpler and better, I think you're probably right, but I think that's more of a statement about how absolutely horrendous Android began and less about how amazing it is today. So, as we just discussed about having systems programmers choosing APIs, well, maybe they finally stopped doing that, and maybe therefore the APIs are a bit better. But also, to give a little bit of an olive branch to the early Android APIs, that was also a time when they were running on phones that just had next to no performance. The CPUs were slow. There was no dedicated graphics memory. There was very little RAM. I mean, these people were shipping an operating system and apps on something that was kind of barely more than a flip phone. It was a flip phone with a touch screen. So there were a lot of things, a lot of corners that had to be cut, including by Android developers, just to be able to not have the app just become unresponsive on those low-end devices. So obviously that's changed a lot in recent years. Now Android has a lot more in terms of CPU, RAM, dedicated graphics memory, and these things that it can use. So they're improving where they can. Now, even with my critique of the Flutter APIs, I'm still confident that Flutter's APIs are well beyond the ergonomics of Android. So even though Flutter is getting worse in some regards in the framework, I think it's still probably well beyond the ergonomics of where Android sits today. Whether those two curves ever intersect remains to be seen. But my understanding is that Jetpack Compose got its start by literally copying swaths of the Flutter code base. And welcome to the inside of a really big company. I think most Flutter developers would think, well, why didn't you just embrace Flutter? Instead of copying parts of Flutter, why didn't you just somehow work Flutter into the broader Android story? But when you consider all the corporate interests at play, that was just never going to happen in a million years. So they came into the Flutter code base, took a bunch of that code and went off and created a competitor. And now here we are.
Are you into conspiracies? Want to hear one?
Conspiracies happen all the time. It's just that it's not Bigfoot and UFOs.
No, not Bigfoot, but I've had a conspiracy theory about why Jetpack Compose came to be and etc. So currently it's kind of irrelevant because all of that was conceived. I thought about this when Oracle was suing Google over Android APIs. And there was a point of time when it looked like Google is in trouble because they won the initial ruling, but then the more senior court overturned it, and it looked like Oracle might actually win this thing. And if they would win, they would get an injunction, and they would probably ask for control of part of Android ecosystem. So my conspiracy theory is that Flutter and Jetpack Compose are both kind of products of that era where Google just prepared for switching the entire ecosystem from Android to something else being Fuchsia, of course. And we know that Google eventually won this lawsuit after a decade or something like that of back and forth, and Fuchsia is probably dead in the waters. Speaking of Nest, I think the only platform where Fuchsia actually launched was Nest, right?
I think that's correct. There's some number of those home devices where Fuchsia is currently running. I don't know what the future plans are for that operating system.
Yeah, I think no one does. And I think the reason they couldn't just switch everyone to Flutter, it will be unreasonable. Like there are huge code bases out there, and you can't really rewrite those applications. It wouldn't be possible.
Yeah, I don't know. There's certainly challenges there, but you also got to remember the kind of budget that flows to the Android team. I mean, the budget that the Flutter team gets is probably pennies, a drop in the bucket compared to the Android team. So had the Android organization aligned with the Flutter team and said, we're going to stop shipping our own UI toolkit in the operating system, and we're just going to embrace Flutter. Flutter will be the UI toolkit of Android. My guess is there could have been any number of paths forward that could have made that reasonable and workable, but it has to begin with alignment. And there was never going to be that alignment between those two organizations.
Yeah, they decided that we'll just fork Flutter and translate it into Kotlin. And the end result will be Jetpack Compose, which ended up being, well, really unfortunate addition to Android Toolbox, in my opinion. Of course, most Android developers wouldn't agree with me. But
so does that mean that do you prefer inflating XML layouts and mutating view hierarchies? Is that what you like over Jetpack Compose?
If those two options would be equivalent in terms of the long-term maintainability and talent, and given all other constraints, yes, I will take views today. Even today, I would take views. I started a new project about 2.5 years ago, and it used like Java and views. So, and today, like several projects that I've seen lately, and the one that I'm currently involved in, I think it was a big mistake to introduce Jetpack Compose into those projects, and it's a real struggle right now. Again, everyone understands that at some point you do need to migrate to Jetpack Compose just because Google is keen on dragging everyone into this ecosystem, and people and companies are probably justifiably scared of being left behind without developers maintaining their code bases. But generally speaking, yes, the world where Jetpack Compose doesn't happen, in my opinion, would be a much better world with so much less churn and unnecessary work. Because even today, like I work on the project where I see the huge amount of waste, and still developers claim that Jetpack Compose makes them more productive. So there's something about it that just doesn't allow developers to see themselves from the side and understand that they spend so much time fighting with this beast. Especially like if you start a new project, I guess it will be much simpler, it will flow, and maybe there you would get some benefit. But introducing Jetpack Compose into existing projects is just awful experience. But as you say, the politics of a big company, when all these big guys introduce Jetpack Compose, after 2 or 3 years of hard work, they will write a blog post about how it made them so much more productive, while you spend 2-3 years and your team size grew 200% over that span. So I haven't heard of one company that embraced Jetpack Compose and reduced their team size, or even stayed the same team size.
So I can't speak to to the integration of Jetpack Compose. Maybe there's infrastructure problems there. I will say that I think the future of user interface development has to start with declarative UI. I do think that as a paradigm, that's where we've got to go, because there are so many people who actually can move so much more quickly with declarative UI, and declarative UI can cover the vast majority of UI needs. So I do still get myself into situations where once in a while I have to go write a custom render object. And so for comparison, a custom render object in Flutter is roughly equivalent to a view in Android or a UI view in iOS. And once you're used to just composing widgets, a custom render object is ungodly complicated. You have so much more of a life cycle that you have to worry about, and so many more implications for what each of those steps might do. For example, you have gesture callbacks you need to handle. You have a layout call you need to handle. You have a paint call you need to handle. You have an apply paint transform that you need to handle. There's just all these pieces that have to come together in that object.
And after you're finished, if you have text, you need to then take care of accessibility yourself.
Yeah, I mean, ideally you could take your render object, put it, because you're going to use your render object as a widget. You need to implement the render object behind it. Ideally, you could wrap your widget with, for example, an accessibility, a semantic node, a focus node, that kind of stuff. But you might have to do something in your render object for that purpose as well. Related to that is the gesture arena. If you need deeper control over what happens with gestures, you've got to actually instantiate and manage your own gesture arena, which 5 people in the world know how to do at this point. So when I look at how much I can build without ever writing a custom render object, and then when I look at all of the things you have to understand to write a custom render object, I am fully in the world of the viewpoint that the place that everyone should be starting is declarative UI. And then as you need it, you get to imperative render trees. But I'm very happy to leave the world behind where everything was an imperative render tree. Because even if you and I are motivated enough to figure that out, I think if we're being realistic about the average developer is not motivated enough to figure that out. And so they're either just not doing useful work, or they're ruining the code that you and I wrote because they didn't take the time to learn what all those different lifecycle hooks were actually meant to do. So I'm very happy with declarative UI, and I hope that's a trend that's here to stay.
Great. So first of all, thank you for justifying your handle, super declarative. So you mentioned several frameworks, React Native, you mentioned Angular JS, something that I've never seen. Well, I heard about one project that used it many years ago, but today I don't think anyone would look at that. And there's the new guy, KMP, Kotlin multi-platform, which is also, and then Compose multi-platform, which is also multi-platform framework. So looking at the landscape today, and put aside a little bit your hat as the Flutter Maximalist, what will be your kind of assessment of the use cases for different frameworks? In which cases you think Flutter would excel? In which cases you think something else using different architecture or different approach might be a better choice? Or again, if you can make a case for why Flutter is the ultimate tool that is better in all cases, that's also fine.
So Flutter presently is certainly not the best option in all cases, but I've consistently made the argument that it could be. And that's why in my Twitter bio, I'm a Flutter Maximalist. If Flutter were to maximize its available value, it would clearly be an easy sell as the default UI toolkit for all apps and all platforms. Flutter has not delivered that value, and I'm not going to pretend that it has. There's still a long way to go. But to your question about where we are today, how do I see the landscape? So React Native, I'm just really behind on that. So React Native, it looked for a time like it was headed to the ash heap of history. It's just there wasn't a whole lot that made it preferable over alternatives, and companies were getting rid of it. There must have been some kind of maintainer resurgence in that project, because they've come back with a bunch of interesting integrations that occasionally are making it through my feed. And if those integrations are what they appear to be, I mean, we've got React Native now doing a bunch of interesting shader stuff, it looks like, which even Flutter has a lot of work to go to make shader integration ergonomic. So it looks like somehow React Native has come back and made itself relevant again. And that's, I guess, credit to the developers who have done that core level work. I still don't know enough about it in its present form to know when and if it's applicable. I would guess that maybe the historical guidance still stands, which is if you're an existing browser-based developer and you really just don't ever want to learn anything but browser-based tools, then React Native is probably the obvious default option for you. Outside of that group, I don't necessarily know what the selling point of React Native might be.
Might I interject with a question? Lately, Shopify announced that they rewrote their native applications of 10 years into React Native. And there's another company in Israel called Wix, which are very into React Native. And I think one of the things that is so great about React Native and JavaScript ecosystem in general is the ability to customize, basically white label stuff. So let's say Wix is the company that allows you to build your own website easily, a website builder basically. So the React Native there powers their ability to give you an application quickly that you customize, basically white labeling application, something that you wouldn't be able to do with, let's say, Android or iOS native apps. You can't customize, well, you can, but it's much more difficult to customize native code than, let's say, JavaScript, which is evaluated at runtime. You just ship a different version of JavaScript, you get a different application. Could you just say a little bit whether Flutter supports something of these use cases? Are there like, I think you mentioned at the beginning of the podcast that some company has some runtime evaluation of Flutter code. What's going on there?
So I'll answer that in just a second. Let's also not miss the fact that Shopify and Wix are literally browser-based companies. Shopify, what they sell you are web solutions. What Wix sells you is websites. So imagine what their tech team probably looks like, and then ask yourself, of all the app development tools, what's most likely to work for their existing tech developers without additional education? Well, I'm guessing that most of their tech team is very browser focused. So and it's no surprise to me, they end up going with the cross-platform UI toolkit that uses JavaScript and for some reason uses CSS and HTML. But to answer your question, what you're referring to is what is often called code push. The idea that you can push a code update to your app from a remote server. This has been one of the most requested features of Flutter for many years. One of the people who created Flutter and ran the Flutter team, Eric Seidel, left Google a couple years ago, and he started a company called Shorebird to bring code push to Flutter. So Google said they're never going to do it for whatever their internal political reasons. Eric said, fine, I'll go do it myself. So Shorebird has reached, they've reached 1.0. They're beyond 1.0. They consider themselves stable now for iOS and Android. They are very focused on App Store compliance because there are rules about this. There are rules about what you can push to your app and what you can't. So they've taken steps to make sure they're in full compliance. They've also taken some steps on the security front. So their servers never actually see your source code. So if you have sensitive source code, you can rest assured they are just here to push the final product where it needs to go. Their tools never see it. Now, I have no affiliation with Shorebird, and I'm certainly not a spokesperson for Shorebird. So if you want to learn more, I'm not sure what their website is. It might be shorebird.dev, might be shorebird.com. I apologize for not remembering that, but go check that out. Eric Seidel is leading that up. Felix, who created Flutter Block, he's well known for that. He was also a big name over at Very Good Ventures for a long time. He's also on the Shorebird team as well, and they regularly announce their latest releases on Discord. So if code push is something that has held you back in the past from using Flutter, I'm happy to report that there is an option out there, and there's a certain amount of usage you can get from Shorebird for free. And then it seems like they have some very reasonable premium or paid tiers as well for some of the larger efforts, larger apps out there.
So technically, architecturally, Flutter Dart code can be evaluated at runtime. That's what you say.
So I'll go into that a little bit, but I want to stress the fact that I'm not an engineer on the team, and they will give you infinitely more detail if you go ask them. But Flutter has always had the concept of hot reload, right? What was hot reload? That was local code push. You're running the Flutter app locally and you're pushing updates from your IDE essentially into your running app. The way that's always been accomplished is with essentially a kind of a form of bytecode or your just-in-time compilation. You can compile Flutter code, dark code, in two different ways. AOT, ahead of time compiled, and then I actually all of a sudden forget what they call the intermediate version. But you and I come from a Java background. We know about bytecode as this intermediate format. There's essentially something like that for dark code as well. When you're working in debug mode, you're using essentially the Dart bytecode, which can then be injected into the runtime in the app. Typically, when you build for release, you do a full, complete, optimized compilation called AOT, and you ship that as actual binary code. What Shorebird does is, I can't remember if they keep all of your code in the intermediate format or just pieces of it, but there are at least pieces of your code that are kept in this intermediate format so that Shorebird can then take your changes, your patches, also use that, compile that with the intermediate code, and then send that to your app in a similar way to how you run hot reload when you're working locally. Again, this is a real layperson description of that, but that's roughly what's happening with code push.
I think that's just amazing. I never thought about it like this, but it's amazing that the same tool that makes you productive as a developer is the same tool that enables, well, critical business capability in many cases. I think it's just very smart. I will definitely read a little bit more about it. It sounds super interesting. And especially given Android native tools kind of try to copy hot reload, and we constantly get the next version, which is maybe a little bit better than the previous one, but still, I wrote a simple Flutter app. By the way, I want to say that I had exactly the same experience. In 20 hours, I wrote a simple Flutter app from not knowing Flutter to like something working with several screens and navigation and a little bit of animations. In 20 hours, it was absolutely fast. And yes, hot reload was instrumental. Amazing insight that hot reload is the same feature that allows you to implement code push. So sorry, I interrupted you. So we said Flutter is absolutely the best, and if a little bit more thought and work will be given to it, it will be ultimate solution for everything, in your opinion.
Yeah, and that,
well, not everything, but let's say high level applications.
All user interfaces. So I never describe Flutter as an application framework, and I think it was a big mistake for the Flutter marketing team to lean into that. Flutter is not an application framework. It has no opinion about how you integrate with Bluetooth or NFC or how you choose to do your networking or where you cache things. There's a million details in an application that have nothing to do with Flutter. So when I say that Flutter should be used everywhere, I mean as a UI toolkit. All the rest of that is up to you. Do whatever you want. I don't care, and I don't think the Flutter team should take on the responsibility of figuring it out. But again, Flutter's not there right now. Flutter, there was this really unique moment around 2018, 2019, 2020. This was before Jetpack Compose and Swift UI really became a thing. This is when React Native, they hadn't done any of their recent improvements. There was no .NET MAUI on the Windows side. Flutter was kind of the only option. It was the first mover in this space. I know there have been things historically like Qt, which goes to multiple platforms, but that's C++. That's like in terms of modern simplicity and ergonomics, that's the opposite of the way things are moving. So Flutter was this first mover, and it had a few years to make the case that it should be the default UI toolkit for everything. It didn't do it. I hate to say it. I said at the time, this is a once in a lifetime moment, because once the alternatives enter the space, there's no going back. We will be fragmented forever. So I was very vocal at the time. I said, you need to be aggressive, because this is the only opportunity we're going to get to not live in a fragmented world. And let me explain why that's relevant. Fragmentation among development teams or among work product is easily understood. A company hires, 3 different teams that build 3 different apps. We've seen how that costs an astronomical amount of money, and it's easy to see why one app team building one app is way cheaper. That's the cost savings within a single company. But then what about us as developers? What about the cost of our careers? We have similar fragmentation where we go to company A and they use Flutter, and now we go to company B and they're only Swift UI, and we go to company C and they're only React Native. Okay, well, each one of those companies saves a lot of money, but you and me, we have to go buy the books, watch the videos, go through the tutorials, go through the learning pains over and over and over and over again. Our careers are now paying the cost of fragmentation instead of companies. I am as angry about that waste of time as I was angry about the waste of money in companies. I'm glad we've solved the waste of money in companies, but now developers are still, like, we are going to waste half of our careers relearning how to center a piece of text on the screen or add a button or show a video. And it's such an astronomical waste of life and productivity. It drives me nuts. And so I was saying in 2017, 18, 19, 20, there's a moment here. If Flutter maximizes its marketing and value, it can make the case that not always, but like the default app, any average app that you start on any platform could render with Flutter. And there's just no need to render with something else. Right when the Flutter team should have been pressing the gas, I think they were kind of resting on their laurels. I think they took a breather, they kind of sat back and they slowed down. And that's right when, okay, now we've got Swift UI coming on the scene. Now here's Jetpack Compose. Now React Native is having a resurgence. Here's .NET MAUI. Now JetBrains is taking Jetpack Compose and creating a Compose multi-platform. Now we're back in the world of fragmentation. And probably we're stuck here forever now. Now we're going to have to do the thing that I just said, which is when you change companies, you might have to completely change your UI toolkit. And that means what you spent the last 3 years learning. Yes, there are some translatable skills, but a lot of it is new. So if you go from Flutter to Swift UI, for example, you're going from Dart to Swift, you're going from Flutter to Swift UI, you're going from Android Studio or VS Code over to Xcode, you're going from the pub ecosystem to what was CocoaPods, but is now what, Swift Package Manager, I think. So like people act like it's this really minor difference. It's not minor at all. It's everything. The minor part is what you actually get to reuse. The majority is different and it's new and it has different problems and different historical details that you have to reckon with. And every time you have to relearn that, just think to yourself what you could be doing with your life instead of relearning it. And I don't even just mean in case of productivity, but like you could be spending time with your family and friends and taking vacations. It's like you're giving up real things in life because Apple is at war with Google, is at war with Microsoft, is at war with Facebook. And for that reason, you and I spend significant portions of our career doing literally non-productive tasks because those massive companies just refuse to play in a sandbox where the baseline language and UI toolkit is the same.
Well, they basically they create their own walled gardens, and they want to create vendor lock-in, basically at the developer's experience level.
Yeah. And I don't have any particular love for Google just because they created Flutter. The unique thing about Flutter, like I said before, is that it had a first mover advantage. If Apple had produced an actually open portable UI toolkit as a first mover, I would have gone to that. And I would have been saying this exact same thing about that. The point was that the first mover could have been the last mover. But it's really tough to do and you have to make it your mission. And I don't think the Flutter team's mission was ever to be the last mover. I think they're kind of like, well, we're just going to do what we're going to do and we're going to show it to people. And if they show up, that's great. And we think competition is good. And if people want to use other stuff, great. We'll learn from them too. But what I was saying the whole time is the waste of developer productivity and life is like a multi-trillion-dollar per year problem, most likely. And that could have been addressed here, and it wasn't. So at present, I'm not saying that Flutter is the best for all things in all cases. They didn't get there. They're still not there. They might never get there. So let's say I were going to build an iOS or Mac specific app, just Apple styling, doing Apple things. yeah, Swift UI is where I would go. I'd love to be able to tell you that Flutter works just as well. Right now, it doesn't. The Cupertino widgets are way out of date. And if you're doing like what the Apple team has done, here's the thing about Swift UI. The Apple team has clearly identified certain use cases that they want to facilitate, and they've worked to create very simplistic high-level APIs to achieve those goals. So if you're doing things that the Apple team thinks that you should do, Swift UI appears to make your job incredibly easy.
Mm-hmm.
Now, if you want to do something different that the Apple team hasn't considered or they don't want you to do, good luck. Then I think people start pulling out their hair. But if you're doing Apple-styled things that Apple knows that you want to do, the truth is right now, it's hard to beat the ergonomics of Swift UI. And so that is what I would do. Now, would I ever use Jetpack Compose? Probably not. I don't want to touch Android. If I can never touch it again, that'd be great. But if I have to go to Android, it might just be my personal history, but I just have no interest to ever again be dependent on the Android organization. So I'll just take Flutter to Android if that's what I'm going to, if Android is where I need to go. On Windows and Linux, the questions there are more so based on your own experience. If you're already big into .NET, I don't have enough experience to tell you whether Flutter is going to be better or worse than something like .NET MAUI. But for me, I have no C# and .NET background, so it's not even a question. I'm using Flutter. Same thing for Linux. Whatever the UI toolkit is, I can't write a single line of C++ without going cross-eyed. So for me, I'm taking Flutter to Linux. But if you are just going to Windows or you are just going to Linux and you have a lot of background there, I'm not in a position to tell you that you should actually go learn how to use Flutter. Maybe you actually are faster with what you already know how to do. So I think that would be my overall assessment of the current landscape.
And would you consider React Native or Kotlin multi-platform for anything at this point?
Well, when you say Kotlin multi-platform, do you mean that or do you mean Compose multi-platform?
Kotlin multi-platform specifically. And my next question would be, do you think it would be reasonable to pair Kotlin multi-platform with Flutter instead of Compose multi-platform? So the first question is, would you consider React Native Kotlin multi-platform? And you can ask the follow-up question, would it be beneficial to pair Flutter with Kotlin multi-platform?
I'll start with React Native because there are a few details we have to work out with the Kotlin side. React Native, the only way I would consider React Native is if somehow there was something I absolutely had to do that React Native could do and Flutter couldn't. There's probably no world where I would want to use React Native. I can't stand the idea of bringing browser technologies into places they don't belong. It's exactly the wrong move.
Mm-hmm.
What we should be doing is taking existing programming tools from the last 50 years and making those available in the browser, not taking browser document tools and imposing them on applications. And it's not just me who thinks this way. WebAssembly is essentially what I just described. The purpose of WebAssembly is to say that you can take your Rust or your Python or your Dart and you can compile it to code that can be run in the browser. The point being, the browser should be a portable operating system, not a glorified document viewer, which is where HTML and CSS and JavaScript came from. So the idea of taking HTML and CSS and JavaScript and bringing it to mobile apps, it drives me nuts and I can't stand the JavaScript language. So for that reason, I will, until that aspect of React Native changes, which it probably never will because it's promoted by web developers, I'll never choose to use React Native if I can at all avoid it. And I think up to the present day, Flutter can do anything that I'm likely to need to do. There's nothing special about React Native in terms of projects that I work on. So that's the React Native perspective from me. By the way, if you bring a web developer on here, probably give you the exact opposite opinion, right? But that's where I see things. Now, Kotlin multi-platform, that's a language, right? That's not a UI toolkit. Compose multi-platform is the UI toolkit. Kotlin multi-platform is just the idea that you can compile Kotlin for different platforms.
Yeah.
So when you ask, would I use KMP? Only if I'm trying to consume a significant amount of existing Kotlin code. So if there's an existing package or set of packages that maybe I need on the server or something like that, then I'm open to it, because really the only reason I'm using KMP is as an interop. I need to get into those packages. So why not use KMP? I think that's totally fine and reasonable. Given that Dart also compiles to all platforms, and I'm already familiar with the pub ecosystem, by default, my answer is just to keep using Dart and to keep using pub. If I can do that, I will. If pub is lacking, if there's only something available in the world of Kotlin, then I'm willing to consider KMP. In terms of Compose multi-platform, the UI toolkit, that's just Jetpack Compose taken everywhere. And so my same rationale about Jetpack Compose applies to Compose multi-platform. I'm not interested in being bound to JetBrains and the Android team, and I'm not interested in Android-centric decisions becoming everybody's decisions, because eventually that will happen. I doubt that Compose multi-platform will ever fundamentally diverge from Jetpack Compose. But Jetpack Compose is the solution for Android. So any problem that ever comes up for Android will have to be solved in Jetpack Compose, and in all likelihood, JetBrains will have to copy that decision into Compose multi-platform. So now Android problems are becoming everybody's problems. I don't really want to be a part of that future.
That's a very interesting take. I actually think that I think we'll see a major competition between JetBrains and Google going forward. I suspect that they had, again, going back to my conspiracy, they were bound together by this thread that Oracle will overtake part of the Android ecosystem, that they will win this loan suite. So Google had to prepare for that strategically. But once that's out of the picture, now Google seem to be trying to decouple themselves from JetBrains, while JetBrains seems to be fighting for ID dominance once again.
Where do you see so you say they're decoupling. Where do you see the decoupling happening?
I think we have the Google's ID, new cloud-based Google's ID.
IDX?
Something like that. Yeah, I can't see any reasonable business case for that at all. The only thing I can see is a strategic move to decouple themselves from external dependency, because I can't see how Google will make any money off that. And on the JetBrains side, okay, they are being threatened by this newer AI IDs. So they've been dominant for many years, but the AI landscape changes so quickly. So now I constantly see people using this new cursor thing. I don't know if you've given it a try already. I haven't yet. So basically, we have ID wars again, full steam ahead, and I just don't think that the Android team, since they are threatened by the Flutter team, right? So they try to stay kind of relevant. So they seem to be contributing to Kotlin multi-platform effort, even though I expected that to cease after Google won the lawsuit. But it does seem like the paths of JetBrains and Google are about to diverge in some aspects. I'm not saying that Google will drop Android Studio. That would be really big of a move. But at the very least, it seems that they are preparing backup plan for that.
Yeah, I mean, it could be. You have as much knowledge about that as I do. The one part that just keeps sticking out to me, though, is Kotlin, the language, was created by JetBrains. Now, I don't know what the licensing is on that, but at some level, Kotlin is the property of JetBrains. And Google already went through the absurd effort, absurd just in size and cost, of migrating the Android world from Java to Kotlin. I cannot imagine them doing that again with another language. So the question becomes, if JetBrains and Google are going to become adversarial, what happens to Kotlin? And also part of that is nearly all use of Kotlin is in Android. So this language that JetBrains created, almost all use is in this thing that's owned by Google called Android. So I tend to think that they will stay very, very closely tied, even if this IDE specific part is a little weird. It's also worth noting that, like you mentioned, Cursor, IDX is probably not the primary competition for for JetBrains. Probably the world of VS Code and all of its extensions and forks is where a lot of this competition is coming in for JetBrains. So I would, if I had to guess, I would guess that JetBrains isn't too worried about IDX and that kind of stuff, and they're more worried about what's coming from the Microsoft world. But time will tell. You might be right. Maybe, and I don't pay a whole lot of attention to what's happening with Android, so maybe there are more wrinkles behind the scenes than what I can see.
Yeah, I think your take is absolutely correct, and I didn't imply that JetBrains will be worried about IDX. They will be worried about Visual Studio and the cursor or whatever comes next. But I think IDX is such a unexplainable, inexplicable waste on Google's side that they will probably never generate any revenue from that.
We are in the world of AI, as you point out. So think about what benefit there might be
training data.
If a large number of developers are writing code in their cloud service.
Yeah, I thought about this, but it looks like a much simpler and much saner solution would be to buy GitLab. I just don't think that trying to reinvent IDE and hoping to bring it to the market and win over IDE market, which will take many, many years, is something that you do when you are threatened and you are worried about being left behind in AI race, which rages like in the matter of months and not years. So
yeah,
that's why I don't think it's really, we don't know. We just speculate here, but it just doesn't sound like a very good strategy of going that way. Okay, Matt, I'm absolutely amazed by this podcast. You share so much invaluable insight. I feel like my brain is working 110% of its capacity right now because I see so many new connections and so many new aspects. And I must say that maybe even I will consider Flutter for something more than just a simple app that I wrote. You make a really compelling case for it. For the conclusion of this podcast, where people can find you, whether they are Flutter developers willing to contribute to Flock, or maybe they just want to follow you and get your thoughts, your insights into their timelines.
Yeah, so the place to go is X/Twitter. You can follow me at superdeclarative. There's one letter missing because there wasn't enough length in the allowable handle. So it's SUPR declarative on X Twitter. You can also go to superdeclarative.com. I link to socials there, but also you can hire me for proprietary work. My open source work, I lead a small team that does paid open source work. That's at flutterbountyhunters.com. We're always happy to either bring in new funders on existing packages to expand them or to create new packages that your company out there might need and want to support in the open source world. So I think those are probably the three places. I will also plug that every Wednesday at 12 p.m. Pacific, I co-host a space on X Twitter. We call it Flutter Spaces. And these are, sometimes we have guests and topics, sometimes we have open discussions, but everybody's welcome to come listen. And we also welcome everybody up on stage. So anybody who's watching this right now, you can come up, you can ask us questions, offer comments. It's just completely open discussion about Flutter and Dart. And again, if you just follow me on X Twitter, I post sometime later today, I will post the schedule for tomorrow's space. And that's how I do it. So if you follow me, you'll see that post and you can join us on Wednesday.
Amazing. Thank you very much. And I wish you a lot of luck with your initiative. And I do hope that it will take off and we'll see, if not completely parallel development of Flutter, then at the very least, we'll see a major effort contributing back to this framework which you are so excited about.
Yeah, listen, I appreciate you having me and having the opportunity to explain all these things. I think we had a really productive conversation. And so thanks for having me on the show.
Thank you very much.